ran without looking back. But what was she running from, and why was a crumpled photo the one thing she couldn't let go of? This is a story of rain-soaked secrets, forbidden truths, and a detective who dares to chase both justice and ghosts. Thank you so much for watching and for all your comments. Let me know at the end if you liked the story, and where you're watching from, and why you're following this. The rain fell in sheets against the cobblestones of Philadelphia, turning the narrow streets into rivers of darkness that reflected the gas lamps like scattered stars. It was the autumn of 1895, and the city wore its gloom like a widow's veil, heavy and impenetrable. Detective Thomas Ashford stood beneath the awning of the Chestnut Street railway station, watching the downpour with the patience of a man who had learned that answers rarely came quickly. At 32 years of age, he was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell slightly across his forehead, and gray eyes that seemed to notice everything, even the smallest detail that others might overlook. He had joined the Philadelphia Police Department 6 years ago, after serving briefly as a Pinkerton agent, and had quickly earned a reputation for solving cases that others deemed impossible. Tonight, however, he was not on official business. He was waiting for a train that should have arrived 20 minutes ago, delayed by the storm that had swept across Pennsylvania like an unwelcome guest. The telegram in his coat pocket had been brief, almost cryptic. Arriving Philadelphia, October 18th, evening train. Urgent matter. Cannot discuss by wire. Regards, Nathaniel Pemberton. Nathaniel had been Thomas's mentor during his early days as a detective, a man of impeccable judgment and unwavering integrity. If he said the matter was urgent, Thomas knew it was not an exaggeration. The shriek of a train whistle cut through the sound of rain, and Thomas straightened, pulling his coat tighter against the cold. Steam billowed from beneath the arriving locomotive as it groaned to a halt, and passengers began to disembark, hurrying through the rain with newspapers held over their heads or umbrellas tilted against the wind. Thomas scanned the crowd, searching for the familiar figure of his old friend, but what he saw instead made his breath catch in his throat. A woman emerged from one of the passenger cars, moving with a desperate urgency that set her apart from the other travelers. She was young, perhaps 26 or 27, with auburn hair that had come loose from its pins and now clung to her rain-soaked face. She wore a black morning dress, the fabric heavy with water, and carried only a small carpet bag clutched tightly in one hand. But it was her eyes that captured Thomas's attention, wide with fear and darting back and forth as if she expected someone to leap from the shadows at any moment. She stumbled slightly as she stepped onto the platform, and Thomas instinctively moved forward, though he did not yet understand why this stranger's distress affected him so deeply. "Madam, are you quite all right?" he called out, his voice carrying above the noise of the station. She turned toward him, and for a moment their eyes met. Hers were a striking shade of green, like sea glass worn smooth by waves, and in them Thomas saw not just fear but a profound sadness that seemed to weigh upon her entire being. She opened her mouth as if to speak, then seemed to think better of it and turned away, hurrying toward the station exit with her head down and her shoulders hunched against the rain. Thomas felt a pull he could not explain, a sense that this woman was connected to something important, though he had no logical reason to believe so. He took a step to follow her, then stopped himself. He was here to meet Nathaniel, not to chase after frightened strangers, no matter how compelling they might be. Yet even as he told himself this, he could not shake the image of her face from his mind. Thomas Ashford. The familiar voice cut through his thoughts, and Thomas turned to see Nathaniel Pemberton making his way through the crowd. The older detective was 60 now, with silver hair and a neatly trimmed beard, but his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most respected investigators in the country. He carried a leather satchel and walked with the aid of a cane, though Thomas suspected the cane was more affectation than necessity. "Nathaniel," Thomas said warmly, extending his hand, "it's been far too long, though I confess your telegram left me more curious than informed." Nathaniel gripped his hand firmly, but there was something troubled in his expression. "Walk with me, Thomas. We should not discuss this matter here, where too many ears might overhear." He glanced around the crowded platform, and Thomas noticed the way his old mentor's gaze lingered on the exit where the woman in black had disappeared moments before. They left the station together, stepping into the rain-soaked street where Nathaniel's driver waited with a carriage. Once inside, with the door closed and the sound of rain drumming against the roof, Nathaniel finally spoke. 3 weeks ago, a man named Charles Whitmore was found dead in his study in Boston, Nathaniel began, his voice low and serious. The official ruling was suicide. A gunshot wound to the head, the weapon found in his hand, a note left upon his desk expressing his despair over financial troubles. "But you don't believe it was suicide," Thomas said, knowing his mentor well enough to read between the lines. "I do not," Nathaniel confirmed. "Charles Whitmore was my cousin, though we had not been close in recent years. He was a successful banker, cautious and methodical in all things. The idea that he would take his own life, particularly in such a manner, strikes me as entirely inconsistent with his character. Moreover, there are details about the scene that trouble me greatly." Thomas leaned forward, his detective's instincts fully engaged now. "What sort of details?" "The position of the weapon, for one. It was found in his right hand, yet Charles was left-handed, a fact anyone who knew him could attest to. The note, while bearing his signature, seemed to me to lack certain peculiarities of his usual handwriting, and perhaps most significantly, his young wife vanished on the very night of his death." "Vanished?" Thomas repeated, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the cold rain outside. "Completely," Nathaniel said grimly. "Her name is Clara Whitmore, née Brennan. She was 27 years old, married to Charles for less than 2 years. According to the household staff, she left the house around midnight, carrying only a small bag, and has not been seen since. The Boston police have issued notices seeking information about her whereabouts, suggesting she may have information crucial to understanding her husband's death. Some have gone so far as to imply she might have been involved in it." Thomas felt his pulse quicken. "Nathaniel, the woman I just saw on the platform, wearing mourning clothes and fleeing as if pursued, could she possibly be—" "Clara Whitmore," Nathaniel finished, his voice heavy with certainty. "Yes, Thomas, I believe you have just laid eyes upon the very woman at the center of this mystery. I received information suggesting she might be traveling to Philadelphia under an assumed name, which is why I asked you to meet me here tonight. I had hoped to intercept her before she disappeared into the city, but it seems she moves more quickly than I anticipated." The carriage rattled through the dark streets, and Thomas's mind raced with possibilities. A dead banker, a missing widow, questions about suicide versus murder. It was exactly the sort of complex puzzle he had built his career upon solving. Yet there was something else, something he could not quite name, that made this case feel different from all the others. "You want me to find her?" he said, and it was not a question. "I want you to find the truth," Nathaniel corrected gently. "Clara Whitmore is either a woman fleeing from terrible grief and unfair suspicion, or she is a murderess who has escaped justice. Until we know which, she remains both a person in need of protection and a potential danger. Your reputation for discretion and thoroughness precedes you, Thomas. I can think of no one better suited to unravel this tangle." Thomas nodded slowly, already mentally cataloging the steps he would need to take. "I'll need to know everything you can tell me about Charles Whitmore, his business affairs, his associates, and most importantly, about Clara herself. Who was she before the marriage? What do we know of her character?" Nathaniel reached into his satchel and withdrew a thick envelope. "I've compiled what information I could gather. Clara Brennan was the daughter of a schoolteacher in Portland, Maine. Her father died when she was 17, her mother 2 years later. She worked as a governess for several wealthy families in Boston, which is how she came to meet Charles. By all accounts, she was well-educated, gentle-natured, and utterly devoted to the children in her care. Those who knew her expressed shock that she would marry a man nearly 20 years her senior, though Charles was known to be kind and generous despite the age difference. And their marriage? Was it happy? That, Nathaniel said slowly, is where the accounts begin to diverge. Some of the household staff described them as affectionate and content. Others whispered of tensions, of arguments behind closed doors, of Clara seeming increasingly unhappy in the months before Charles's death. There were rumors, too, though I hesitate to give them weight without evidence." "What manner of rumors?" Thomas pressed. "That Clara had formed an attachment to another man. A younger man, someone more suited to her age and temperament. The rumors never named him specifically, and I found no concrete evidence to support the claim. But in a case like this, we must consider every possibility, no matter how distasteful." The carriage came to a halt outside Thomas's modest townhouse on Locust Street. Rain continued to pour from the dark sky, and through the window, Thomas could see the warm glow of the lamp he had left burning in his study. But his thoughts were not on the comfort waiting inside. Instead, he found himself thinking of green eyes filled with fear, of a woman running through the rain with no apparent destination, of a crumpled photograph that might hold the key to everything. "There's one more thing," Nathaniel said as Thomas prepared to step out into the storm. When the police searched Clara's room after her disappearance, they found her jewelry box open and empty. She had taken everything of value, or so they assumed, but the maid who cleaned the room regularly swore that Clara owned a photograph, one she kept hidden at the bottom of a drawer wrapped in silk. It was gone as well. No one knows what the photograph depicted, but the maid said Clara would sometimes take it out and look at it when she thought herself alone, and that seeing it always made her weep. Thomas felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift in his mind, though the picture they might form remained unclear. "I'll find her, Nathaniel, and I'll find the truth, whatever it may be." "I know you will," Nathaniel said, gripping his shoulder with fatherly affection. "But Thomas, be careful. If Clara is innocent, she is a frightened woman running from shadows. If she is guilty, she has already proven herself capable of great deception. In either case, she is dangerous, though perhaps in different ways." Thomas stepped out into the rain, the envelope clutched beneath his coat to protect it from the water. As the carriage pulled away, he stood for a moment in the darkness, letting the cold droplets run down his face as he thought about the task ahead. Somewhere in this vast city, a woman named Clara Whitmore was hiding, carrying secrets that might explain her husband's death or condemn her for it. And Thomas Ashford, who had devoted his life to uncovering truth in the darkest corners of human nature, would not rest until he found her and understood the mystery that surrounded her like a shroud. The morning arrived with a pale, watery light that did little to dispel the gloom hanging over Philadelphia. Thomas had spent most of the night poring over the documents Nathaniel had provided, studying every detail of Charles Whitmore's life and death, until his eyes burned with exhaustion and his mind swam with contradictions. Now, as he sat in a corner booth at Morton's Coffee House on Market Street, he nursed a cup of strong black coffee and watched the morning crowds hurry past the rain-streaked windows. The photograph lay on the table before him, extracted from the envelope just an hour ago. It showed Charles Whitmore in formal attire, standing beside a much younger woman who could only be Clara. The image had been taken on their wedding day, and while Charles smiled with unmistakable pride, Clara's expression was harder to read. Her face was lovely, delicate features framed by dark hair arranged in an elaborate style, but her eyes held a quality that the camera had captured with uncomfortable clarity, a deep, profound sadness that seemed utterly at odds with the joyous occasion. Thomas had seen many wedding photographs in his years as a detective, and he had learned to read the subtle language of posed happiness versus genuine emotion. This photograph troubled him deeply. Clara stood close to her husband, her hand resting lightly on his arm, but there was a distance in her posture, a slight turning away that suggested reluctance rather than devotion. It was the photograph of a woman who had made a choice she was not entirely certain about, and Thomas found himself wondering what circumstances had led her to marry a man she so clearly did not love with the passion a bride should feel. "More coffee, sir?" The waitress's voice broke through his thoughts, and Thomas nodded absently, pushing his cup forward. As she poured, he noticed her glance at the photograph, her expression shifting slightly. "Pardon me for asking, sir, but is that a picture of someone you're searching for?" she asked, her voice lowered conspiratorially. "Only I couldn't help but notice you've been studying at something fierce since you arrived." Thomas looked up at her, seeing a young woman of perhaps 22 or 23, with honest brown eyes and a forthright manner that suggested she was not one for idle gossip. An idea formed in his mind, and he made a quick decision. "As a matter of fact, I am searching for someone," he admitted, pulling out his detective's badge and showing it to her briefly. "The woman in this photograph may be in Philadelphia, and she may be in some distress. I'm trying to locate her to ensure she's safe. Have you by any chance seen anyone matching her description in the past day or so?" The waitress leaned closer, examining the photograph with genuine interest. "She's very beautiful," she murmured, then shook her head slowly. "I can't say I've seen her here, sir, but then we get so many customers, particularly in the mornings. If she's trying to avoid being noticed, she might choose a smaller establishment, somewhere less crowded." "That's sound reasoning," Thomas said, impressed by her quick thinking. "If you should happen to see her, would you be willing to send word to me? My name is Detective Thomas Ashford, and you can reach me through the police department on 11th Street. I assure you, my only concern is for the lady's safety." The waitress nodded seriously. "I'll keep my eyes open, Detective, and I'll mention it to my sister too. She works at the Bellevue Hotel, and they get all sorts of travelers there, especially ladies traveling alone." After the waitress departed, Thomas sat back and considered his next moves. The city was vast, and a woman determined to remain hidden could lose herself in its crowds with relative ease. But Clara Whitmore had arrived with almost nothing, which meant she would need to find lodging, food, and eventually some means of supporting herself if she intended to stay in Philadelphia for any length of time. These necessities would force her into contact with the world, creating opportunities for someone persistent enough to find her. He spent the remainder of the morning making discreet inquiries at hotels, boarding houses, and railway stations within a radius of the Chestnut Street station where he had first glimpsed Clara. He showed the wedding photograph to desk clerks and porters, always identifying himself as a detective but carefully avoiding any suggestion that Clara was wanted for a crime. Instead, he spoke of a family matter, of concern for a young widow who might be in need of assistance. Most people he spoke with were sympathetic but unhelpful, having seen no one matching Clara's description. It was nearly noon when Thomas found himself on Spruce Street, standing before a modest boarding house with a hand-painted sign that read, "Mrs. Dalton's Respectable Rooms for Ladies." The building was well-maintained but unremarkable, exactly the sort of place a woman seeking anonymity might choose. He climbed the steps and knocked firmly on the door. The woman who answered was perhaps 55, with sharp features and intelligent eyes that assessed Thomas with the practiced gaze of someone accustomed to judging character quickly. "Yes? May I help you? Mrs. Dalton, I presume?" Thomas removed his hat respectfully. "My name is Thomas Ashford. I'm a detective with the Philadelphia Police Department, and I'm hoping you might be able to assist me with a rather delicate matter." Her expression became guarded. "I run a respectable establishment, Detective. My tenants are all decent women of good character, and I won't have any trouble brought to my door." "I assure you, madam, I mean no trouble," Thomas said quickly. "I'm searching for a young woman who may be in distress. She arrived in the city last evening, alone and apparently frightened. I have reason to believe she may have sought refuge in a boarding house such as yours." He withdrew the photograph and held it out. "Have you seen this woman?" Mrs. Dalton took the photograph with obvious reluctance, but as her eyes fell upon Clara's face, Thomas saw a flicker of recognition that she tried unsuccessfully to hide. "I'm not certain," she said too quickly. "Many young women come through here. They all start to look rather similar after a time." "Mrs. Dalton," Thomas said gently, "if this woman is staying with you, I give you my word that I mean her no harm. Quite the opposite, in fact. There are those who believe she may have been involved in her husband's death, but there are also those of us who suspect she may be an innocent woman fleeing from danger or unfair accusation. I cannot help her if I cannot speak with her." The landlady's expression softened slightly, and Thomas sensed he had struck the right chord. "If I were to know of such a woman," she said carefully, "and I'm not saying I do, mind you, but if I were to know of her, what assurance could you give me that speaking with you would not place her in greater jeopardy?" "Only my word as a gentleman and as an officer of the law," Thomas replied, "and the fact that if I meant her harm, I would have arrived with other officers and a warrant, rather than coming here alone and appealing to your better judgment." Mrs. Dalton studied him for a long moment, and Thomas could see the internal struggle playing across her features. Finally, she sighed and stepped back from the door. "She arrived late last night, soaked to the bone and looking as if she'd seen a ghost. Called herself Mrs. Mary Brennan, said she was a widow, traveling to visit family in the city. But I've been running this boarding house for 23 years, Detective, and I know the difference between a woman visiting family and a woman running from something. She had that hunted look about her, kept glancing at the windows as if expecting someone to appear at any moment." "Is she here now?" Thomas asked, trying to keep the urgency from his voice. "She went out about an hour ago," Mrs. Dalton said. "Told me she needed to purchase a few necessities at the market. I offered to have my daughter accompany her, but she insisted on going alone. Said she needed time to think, to clear her head." The landlady's voice dropped lower. "Detective, that poor girl is terrified of something. I could see it in every movement, every word. If she's done something wrong, I'll be shocked. But if someone is trying to hurt her, then I hope you truly mean what you say about protecting her." Thomas felt his heart rate quicken. Which market did she go to? Likely the one on 2nd Street. It's the closest, and she struck me as someone who wouldn't want to venture far from safety. But detective, if you intend to confront her there, I'd ask you to be gentle about it. Whatever she's running from, it's put real fear into her heart. Thomas thanked Mrs. Dalton and hurried down the steps, his mind racing with possibilities. The 2nd Street market was only a few blocks away, and if Clara was still there, this might be his only chance to speak with her before she vanished again into the city's anonymous crowds. As he walked quickly through the damp streets, dodging puddles and other pedestrians, he tried to formulate what he would say to her. How did one approach a frightened widow and convince her that you meant no harm, especially when you yourself were not entirely certain whether she was victim or perpetrator? The market was bustling with afternoon activity when Thomas arrived, vendors calling out their wares while shoppers moved between the stalls examining vegetables, meats, and dry goods. He scanned the crowd methodically, looking for a woman in morning dress, and for several long minutes saw nothing. Then, near a stall selling fresh bread, he caught sight of her. Clara Whitmore stood with her back partially turned to him, examining a loaf of bread with an intensity that seemed excessive for such a simple task. She wore the same black dress from the previous evening, now dried but wrinkled, and her auburn hair was pinned back severely beneath a modest black hat. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes kept darting to the side as if watching for pursuers. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her, and was within a few feet when she suddenly turned, perhaps sensing his presence. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat, neither moved. Thomas saw recognition flash across her face, not recognition of him specifically, but recognition that he was someone who had noticed her, someone who might pose a threat. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said quietly, keeping his voice gentle and non-threatening. "Please, don't run. I mean you no harm. My name is Thomas Ashford, and I'm a detective. I've been asked to find you, but not to arrest you or to cause you distress. I simply want to talk, to understand what happened, and perhaps to help you if I can." Her green eyes widened with panic, and she took a step backward, the bread forgotten in her hands. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice trembling despite the attempt at firmness. "You have me confused with someone else. My name is Mary Brennan, and I'm simply here shopping. Please leave me alone." "I know about Charles," Thomas said softly, watching her face carefully. "I know about Boston, and I know that you're frightened. But running won't solve anything, Mrs. Whitmore. Whatever the truth is, whatever really happened that night, hiding from it will only make things worse." Tears sprang to her eyes, and for a moment Thomas thought she might collapse right there in the market. Her hands shook so violently that she dropped the bread, and she pressed them against her mouth as if to hold back a sob. "You don't understand," she whispered. "You can't possibly understand. They'll never believe me. No one will believe me." "Then help me believe you," Thomas urged, taking a cautious step closer. "Tell me what happened. Tell me why you ran. Tell me about the photograph you keep hidden, the one that makes you weep. Give me a chance to hear your side of this story before you disappear again and leave only suspicion in your wake." She stared at him, and in her eyes Thomas saw a war between hope and despair, between the desire to trust and the fear of betrayal. Around them the market continued its noisy bustle, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. Finally, Clara seemed to reach a decision. Her shoulders sagged slightly, as if a great weight had settled upon them, and she nodded almost imperceptibly. "Not here," she said, her voice barely audible above the crowd. "Too many people, too many eyes. If you truly want to understand, if you truly mean what you say about helping me, then meet me at the Rittenhouse Square Gardens in 1 hour. There's a bench near the fountain, somewhat secluded. I'll tell you everything, but only if you come alone. If I see other officers, if I sense any trap, I'll disappear and you'll never find me again." Thomas nodded slowly, understanding that this was as much trust as she could offer. "I'll be there, alone. You have my word." She searched his face for a long moment as if trying to read his soul, then turned and walked away quickly, leaving Thomas standing alone among the market stalls with more questions than ever. He watched her disappear into the crowd, resisting the urge to follow, knowing that his only chance of learning the truth lay in honoring the fragile trust she had extended. 1 hour. In 1 hour he would meet Clara Whitmore, and perhaps finally begin to understand the mystery that had brought her to Philadelphia in tears and terror, carrying secrets that might damn her or save her, depending on what those secrets revealed. Rittenhouse Square stood as an oasis of tranquility amid the bustling city, its carefully manicured gardens and tree-lined pathways offering respite from the noise and chaos of Philadelphia's commercial districts. Thomas arrived 15 minutes early, as was his habit when meeting informants or witnesses, and positioned himself where he could observe the entrance while remaining partially concealed behind a large oak tree. The rain had ceased, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening, though heavy clouds still threatened overhead and the air held the damp chill of approaching winter. He watched as Clara entered the square precisely on time, her movements cautious and deliberate. She wore a dark shawl over her morning dress now, and carried the same small carpet bag he had seen at the train station. Her eyes scanned the gardens carefully before she made her way to the fountain, where she settled onto the designated bench with the rigid posture of someone preparing for an ordeal. Thomas waited another moment, ensuring no one had followed her, then emerged from his position and approached openly, wanting her to see that he honored his promise to come alone. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said gently as he neared the bench, "thank you for trusting me enough to come." She looked up at him, and in the afternoon light he could see the exhaustion etched into her features, the dark circles beneath those remarkable green eyes, the pallor of her skin that spoke of sleepless nights and constant fear. "I'm not certain trust is the right word, Detective Ashford," she replied, her voice soft but steady. "Desperation, perhaps, or simply the recognition that I cannot run forever, and if I must tell my story to someone, better it be to a man who at least pretends he might believe me." Thomas sat down on the bench, maintaining a respectful distance between them. "I make no pretense about anything, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm searching for the truth, whatever that truth may be. Tell me what happened, from the beginning. Tell me about Charles, about your marriage, and about the night he died." Clara was silent for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed on the fountain before them. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper, as if the words themselves caused her pain. "I never loved Charles," she began, and Thomas heard the weight of guilt in her confession. "That sounds cruel, I know, but it's the truth, and if we're to have honesty between us, then I must start there. Charles was kind to me, generous and patient, but I never loved him as a wife should love her husband. I married him because I was alone in the world, because I was tired of being dependent on the charity of others, because he offered me security and respectability, and a home of my own. I thought that would be enough. I thought I could learn to love him with time. But you didn't," Thomas said quietly, "and it was not a question." "No," Clara confirmed, tears beginning to slide down her cheeks, though her voice remained controlled. "And worse than that, I fell in love with someone else. His name was Daniel Mercer, and he was everything Charles was not. Young, passionate, full of dreams and ambitions. He worked as a clerk in Charles's bank, which is how we met. I tried to resist it, Detective Ashford. I truly did. I knew how wrong it was, how much it would hurt Charles if he knew. But Daniel was like sunlight breaking through clouds, and I had lived in shadow for so long." Thomas felt a complicated mixture of sympathy and concern as he listened. An affair, or at least romantic feelings for another man, certainly provided a potential motive for wanting one's husband dead. Yet there was something in Clara's manner, in the genuine remorse that colored her words, that made him hesitate to draw such a simple conclusion. "Did Charles know about Daniel?" he asked. Clara nodded miserably. "He discovered us 3 weeks before his death. Not in any compromising situation. We had never been indiscreet in that way. But he found letters Daniel had written to me. Beautiful letters, full of poetry and longing. Charles confronted me in his study, and I have never seen a man more wounded. He didn't rage or shout, which somehow made it worse. He simply looked at me with such profound sadness and asked me if I had ever cared for him at all. What did you tell him?" "The truth," Clara said, her voice breaking slightly. "That I cared for him deeply as a friend, that I respected and admired him, but that I could not claim to love him as he deserved. He asked me if I wanted to leave, to be with Daniel instead, and I told him I didn't know. I was confused, torn between duty and desire, between gratitude and genuine feeling. Charles told me he needed time to think, to decide what should be done. He sent Daniel away, gave him a letter of reference and enough money to start over somewhere else, and told him never to contact me again." Thomas could see where this narrative was leading, and his detective's mind began assembling the pieces even as Clara continued her story. "And then Charles died," he prompted gently. 3 days later, Clara confirmed, wiping at her tears with a trembling hand. "I had barely spoken to him in those 3 days. He spent most of his time locked in his study, and when we did encounter each other, the pain in his eyes was unbearable. On the night he died, I had retired early to my room, unable to bear the heavy silence that had settled over the house. Around midnight, I heard a sound from his study, a loud crack that I now know must have been the gunshot. I ran downstairs and found the door locked. I called for the butler, and together we forced it open." She paused, closing her eyes as if trying to block out the memory. Thomas waited patiently, knowing that rushing her now would only cause her to retreat back into silence. "Charles was slumped over his desk," she continued, her voice hollow with remembered horror. "There was blood, so much blood, and the pistol was in his right hand. There was a note as well, written in his hand, saying that he could not bear the shame of what his wife had done, that he had no wish to continue living knowing that the woman he loved desired another. The servants were summoned, the police arrived, and within hours, the official determination was suicide driven by marital distress." "But you don't believe it was suicide?" Thomas said, remembering Nathaniel's words about the pistol being in the wrong hand. "Charles was left-handed, Detective," Clara said urgently, turning to face him fully now. "He did everything with his left hand, wrote with it, ate with it, would certainly have held a pistol with it if he truly intended to take his own life. And there were other things, small details that troubled me. The way the study was arranged, as if someone had been searching for something. A faint smell of cologne that was not Charles's usual scent, and most significantly, something that was missing." Thomas leaned forward slightly, his pulse quickening. What was missing? Clara reached into her carpetbag with shaking hands and withdrew a small object wrapped in cloth. Slowly, she unwrapped it to reveal a crumpled photograph, its edges worn as if it had been handled many times. She held it out to Thomas, and he took it carefully, smoothing it out to examine the image. The photograph showed a young woman, barely more than a girl, holding a baby in her arms. The woman bore a striking resemblance to Clara, though her features were softer, less defined, and her expression held an innocence that Clara's no longer possessed. On the back of the photograph, written in faded ink, were the words, "Catherine and little Clara, Portland, 1869. "Your mother?" Thomas guessed, and Clara nodded. "And me, when I was just 3 months old. My mother died when I was 19, and this photograph was the only possession of hers that I treasured above all others. I kept it hidden because it was precious to me, something private and sacred. But on the night Charles died, someone went through my room while I was downstairs discovering his body. This photograph, which I kept wrapped in silk at the bottom of my jewelry box, was gone. So was most of my jewelry, taken, I suppose, to make it look like a simple theft. But they didn't know about the secret compartment I had built into the bottom of my wardrobe, where I sometimes hid the photograph when I wanted it even more secure. I found it there the next morning, and I realized that whoever killed Charles, whoever wanted it to look like suicide, had also wanted to take something from me, something that mattered deeply." Thomas studied the photograph, his mind working through the implications. But why would someone want this particular photograph? What could it possibly mean to anyone but you? Clara's expression grew even more troubled, and she reached into her carpetbag again, this time withdrawing a letter, yellowed with age and folded many times. This letter was tucked behind the photograph in my jewelry box. I had forgotten it was even there, as I hadn't looked at it in years. It's from my mother to my father, written shortly before I was born. Read it, Detective, and you'll begin to understand why someone might have wanted it, and why I believe Charles's death and the theft of my possessions are connected to a secret my mother carried to her grave. Thomas took the letter and began to read, his eyes widening as the faded words revealed their stunning secret. The letter was dated February 1868, and in it, Catherine Brennan confessed to her husband that the child she carried was not his. She had been involved with another man, a wealthy banker from Boston named Jonathan Whitmore, who had promised to leave his wife for her, but had ultimately abandoned her when she became pregnant. Catherine begged her husband's forgiveness and swore that if he would accept the child as his own, she would never speak of the matter again, and would devote her life to being a faithful wife. "Jonathan Whitmore," Thomas said slowly, the implications crashing over him like a wave. "Charles's father." "Clara, Are you saying that Charles and I shared the same father, though we never knew it? Clara finished, her voice breaking completely now. That I unknowingly married my own half-brother, and that when someone discovered this secret, they decided to use it to destroy us both. The photograph must have shown something, some resemblance or marking that connected me to the Whitmore family, and someone realized the truth. Thomas felt as if the ground had shifted beneath him. The tragedy of Clara's situation was almost unbearable to contemplate. An innocent woman who had married her own half-brother without knowing, who had then fallen in love with another man while trapped in an unwitting, incestuous marriage, and who was now fleeing accusations of murder when she herself was as much a victim as Charles. Who else knew about this letter? He asked urgently. Who could have discovered your true parentage? I don't know, Clara said desperately. I had forgotten the letter even existed. My mother never spoke of it, and my father, the man who raised me, treated me as his true daughter until the day he died. But someone knew, Detective. Someone found out, and they killed Charles to prevent the scandal from becoming public. And they tried to make it look like suicide, or perhaps even like I had killed him, knowing that I would be blamed and unable to defend myself without revealing the shameful truth of what our marriage truly was. Thomas's mind raced through possibilities. A secret this explosive could ruin families, destroy reputations, and provide powerful motive for murder. But who would benefit from Charles's death? Who knew the truth about Clara's parentage? And most importantly, who was still pursuing Clara now, forcing her to flee across state lines in fear for her life? Clara, he said gently, using her given name for the first time. Why did you run? If you're innocent of Charles's murder, why not stay and explain what you've just told me? She laughed bitterly, a sound without humor. Because no one would believe me, Detective Ashford. A young woman married to an older, wealthy man, carrying on an affair with a younger man, suddenly widowed under suspicious circumstances, claiming now that the marriage was invalid due to unknowing incest. It sounds like the desperate invention of a guilty conscience, not the truth. And even if some did believe me, the scandal would destroy what's left of Charles's reputation and my own. I would be branded as either a murderess or an adulteress, or perhaps both, and the Whitmore family would use all their considerable influence to see me punished for daring to sully their name. But you can't run forever, Thomas said, though he understood her fear all too well. Eventually, you'll be found, and then the circumstances will look even worse. Clara turned to him, and in her eyes he saw not just fear, but a desperate kind of hope. That's why I'm telling you this, Detective, because I believe you might be the one person who can help me prove the truth. Someone killed Charles, and that same someone is trying to destroy me. Help me find them. Help me prove my innocence. And perhaps, when this is over, I can finally stop running and find some measure of peace, even if I can never truly escape the tragedy of what my life has become. Thomas looked at this remarkable woman, sitting beside him in a public garden, entrusting him with secrets that could either save her or condemn her, and he felt something shift in his heart. This was no longer just a case, no longer just another puzzle to solve. This was about justice for a man who had died without knowing the full truth of his own life, and protection for a woman who had committed no crime, but was paying the price for sins she never knew she was committing. I'll help you, he said quietly, and saw relief flood Clara's features. But we need to work together. No more running, no more hiding. We'll find who killed Charles and we'll prove your innocence. But I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that? Clara nodded, tears streaming freely now, and impulsively reached out to grasp his hand. The touch sent an unexpected jolt through Thomas, a connection he had not anticipated and could not fully explain. As their eyes met, he recognized something he had seen in his own mirror many times. The loneliness of someone who had built walls around their heart to protect it from further pain. I trust you, she whispered. God help me, I trust you. And in that moment, sitting in Rittenhouse Square as the afternoon light began to fade and the first drops of new rain started to fall, Thomas Ashford made a silent vow that he would not let Clara Whitmore down, no matter what dangers lay ahead or what secrets remained to be uncovered. The rain returned with renewed intensity as Thomas and Clara left Rittenhouse Square, transforming the streets of Philadelphia into rivers of mud and forcing pedestrians to seek shelter beneath awnings and in doorways. Thomas had insisted that Clara could no longer stay at Mrs. Dalton's boarding house, as it was the first place anyone searching for her would look once they realized she was in the city. Instead, he brought her to a small, discreet hotel on Walnut Street, owned by a former colleague from his Pinkerton days, who owed him several favors and could be trusted to ask no questions. Once Clara was safely installed in a modest room on the third floor, Thomas returned to his own townhouse to examine the evidence more carefully and to formulate a plan of action. The letter from Catherine Brennan lay on his desk, alongside the crumpled photograph and detailed notes he had made during his conversation with Clara. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to form a picture, but there were still gaps, still questions that needed answers before he could be certain of the truth. The key, he realized, lay in Boston. Someone in that city knew about Clara's true parentage, someone who had access to the Whitmore household and who stood to gain from Charles's death. Thomas needed to identify that person, but he could not simply travel to Boston and begin asking questions without alerting whoever was behind the murder that Clara had been found and was now under the protection of a detective who believed her story. He was still pondering this dilemma when a knock sounded at his door. Opening it, he found Nathaniel Pemberton standing on his threshold, rain dripping from his coat and concern etched deeply into his weathered features. "Thomas," Nathaniel said without preamble, "I've received troubling news from Boston. May I come in?" Once they were settled in Thomas's study with glasses of brandy to ward off the chill, Nathaniel withdrew a telegram from his coat pocket and handed it across the desk. "This arrived this afternoon. It's from a colleague in the Boston Police Department, someone I trust implicitly. Read it carefully." Thomas unfolded the telegram and read the typed words with growing alarm. "Stop investigation into Whitmore death immediately. Stop new evidence suggests widow Clara Whitmore murdered husband for inheritance. Stop warrant issued for her arrest. Stop believed to be traveling under assumed name. Stop extremely dangerous. Stop authorities in multiple cities alerted. Stop." "They're calling her a murderess," Thomas said quietly, setting the telegram down. "And they're hunting her across state lines. Nathaniel, there's something you need to know. I found Clara. I spoke with her this afternoon and I believe she's innocent. More than that, I believe she's the victim of a conspiracy far more complex than simple murder." Nathaniel's eyebrows rose sharply. "That's quite a claim, Thomas. What evidence do you have to support it?" For the next hour, Thomas laid out everything Clara had told him, showing Nathaniel the letter from Catherine Brennan and explaining the shocking revelation about Clara's true parentage. He detailed the inconsistencies in the scene of Charles's death, the missing photograph, and Clara's conviction that someone had killed her husband to prevent a scandal that would destroy the Whitmore family name. When he finished, Nathaniel sat in silence for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin in the thoughtful pose Thomas remembered from their years working together. Finally, the older detective spoke, his voice heavy with the weight of terrible understanding. "Jonathan Whitmore died 5 years ago," Nathaniel said slowly. "But he left behind more than just Charles. He had another son, Robert, from his marriage. Robert Whitmore is currently the president of the family bank, the position Charles held before his death. If what Clara says is true, if she and Charles were indeed half-siblings unknowingly married, then Robert would have had powerful motivation to ensure that secret never became public knowledge." Thomas felt his pulse quicken, because if the truth came out, it would destroy the family's reputation and potentially call into question the legitimacy of the bank's operations. The scandal would be ruinous. "Precisely," Nathaniel confirmed. "And there's more. Robert Whitmore was in Philadelphia 2 weeks ago, ostensibly on bank business. I know this because I saw him myself, though I thought nothing of it at the time. But if he was here, he could have been tracking Clara, waiting for an opportunity to ensure her silence permanently." The implications crashed over Thomas like a wave. He killed his own brother to protect the family name, made it look like suicide, and then tried to frame Clara for murder when suspicion began to point away from suicide. And now he's hunting her, using the full resources of the Boston police and his family's influence to find her before she can tell anyone the truth. "We need proof," Nathaniel said firmly. "Accusations against a man of Robert Whitmore's standing require ironclad evidence, or they'll be dismissed as the desperate fabrications of a woman trying to avoid justice. But how do we obtain such proof when he controls so many of the investigative resources in Boston?" Thomas stood and began pacing, his mind working through the problem from every angle. "The cologne," he said suddenly, turning to face Nathaniel. Clara mentioned smelling cologne in Charles's study that wasn't his usual scent. If Robert was there that night, if he was the one who killed Charles, he might have left other traces as well. We need to examine that study ourselves, search for evidence the Boston police either missed or deliberately overlooked. That's impossible, Nathaniel objected. The house will be watched and we have no legal authority to search it. Even if we could gain entry, anything we found would be inadmissible if obtained illegally. Then we don't search legally, Thomas said, a plan forming in his mind even as he spoke. We need someone who can get into that house without arousing suspicion. Someone who has a legitimate reason to be there and who can search discreetly while appearing to do something else entirely. Nathaniel's eyes widened with understanding. The servants. They would have access to every room, and their presence would be unremarkable. But how do we convince one of them to help us? They're employed by the Whitmore family, and their loyalty would naturally be to their employer. Thomas smiled grimly. Not if one of them witnessed something that night, something that troubled their conscience. Clara mentioned that the household staff had varying opinions about her marriage to Charles. Some saw affection between them, others saw tension. Someone in that house knows more than they've told the police. I'm certain of it. We just need to find that person and convince them that the truth matters more than their employment. The plan was risky and required perfect timing, but it was their best chance at obtaining the evidence they needed. Nathaniel would return to Boston immediately and make discreet inquiries among the Whitmore household staff, seeking anyone who might have doubts about the official story of Charles's death. Meanwhile, Thomas would remain in Philadelphia to protect Clara and to investigate Robert Whitmore's recent activities in the city, looking for any evidence that he had been tracking her or planning further harm. But as Nathaniel prepared to leave, Thomas stopped him with a hand on his shoulder. There's one more thing, Nathaniel. I need you to understand that my involvement in this case has become more than professional. Clara Whitmore is an innocent woman caught in circumstances beyond her control, and I feel a responsibility to protect her that goes beyond my duty as a detective. Nathaniel studied his former protégé's face carefully, and a knowing smile touched his lips. You care for her, he said, and it was not a question. Be careful, Thomas. Mixing personal feelings with professional investigation is always dangerous, but in a case this complicated, it could prove fatal, for both of you. I know the risks, Thomas said quietly, but I also know that some things are worth fighting for, worth risking everything to protect. Clara deserves justice, and she deserves the chance to build a new life, free from the shadows of secrets she never knew existed. After Nathaniel departed, Thomas sat alone in his study, listening to the rain against the windows and thinking about the remarkable woman who had entered his life so unexpectedly. He had spent years as a detective, maintaining emotional distance from the people involved in his cases, viewing them as puzzles to be solved rather than human beings with hopes and fears and dreams. But Clara had broken through those carefully constructed walls with her courage, her honesty, and her refusal to accept defeat even when everything seemed hopeless. The following morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having finally passed. Thomas arrived at Clara's hotel early, bringing fresh bread and coffee, and found her awake and dressed, sitting by the window and watching the street below with the wariness of someone who expected danger at any moment. Any news? She asked immediately, and Thomas could hear the strain in her voice, the toll that constant fear was taking on her spirit. He told her about Nathaniel's telegram, about Robert Whitmore, and their theory that he had killed Charles to protect the family secret. He watched her face as she processed this information, saw anger and grief and a terrible kind of vindication flash across her features. I knew Charles didn't kill himself, she said fiercely. I knew someone had murdered him, but I never imagined it could be his own brother. What kind of man kills his own flesh and blood to preserve a reputation? The same kind of man who would frame an innocent woman for that murder, Thomas replied grimly. But we're going to stop him, Clara. We're going to prove what he did and make certain he faces justice for it. She turned from the window to look at him directly, and Thomas was struck again by the strength he saw in her eyes, a strength that had been forged in suffering but had not been broken by it. And what happens to me when this is over, Detective Ashford? Even if we prove I didn't kill Charles, the truth about our marriage will still come out. I'll still be the woman who unknowingly married her half-brother, the daughter of an affair, the source of scandal that will be discussed in drawing rooms and whispered about in church pews for years to come. Thomas crossed the room to stand before her, and without consciously deciding to do so, he reached out and took her hands in his. The touch felt natural, right? As if they had known each other far longer than the few brief days since their first meeting. "When this is over," he said softly, "you'll be free. Free from fear, free from suspicion, free to build whatever life you choose for yourself. The scandal will fade, Clara. Gossip always does, eventually. But your courage, your integrity, your refusal to let injustice triumph, those things will remain, and you won't face the future alone if you'll allow me to stand beside you." Tears filled her eyes, but they were different tears than the ones he had seen before. Tears of hope, rather than despair. "Why are you doing this?" she whispered. "Why do you care so much about what happens to me?" Thomas knew the answer to that question, had known it perhaps from the moment he first saw her on that rain-soaked platform, though he had not allowed himself to acknowledge it until now. "Because in all my years of seeking truth and justice, I've never met anyone who embodied those qualities more completely than you do. Because your strength humbles me, and your vulnerability touches my heart. Because when I look at you, I see not a case to be solved, but a woman I could spend a lifetime getting to know and still discover new reasons to admire." Clara's breath caught, and for a long moment they simply stood there, hands clasped, eyes locked, the world beyond that hotel room fading into insignificance. Then, slowly, she leaned forward and rested her forehead against his chest, and Thomas wrapped his arms around her, holding her close as she finally allowed herself to release the fear and grief she had been carrying alone for so long. They remained that way for several minutes, finding in each other's embrace a comfort and connection that neither had expected but both desperately needed. When Clara finally pulled back, her eyes were red, but her expression was calmer, more settled, as if she had found an anchor in the storm that had been threatening to overwhelm her. "I think I could care for you, Thomas Ashford," she said quietly, using his given name for the first time. "Perhaps I already do, but I won't let you sacrifice your reputation or your career for me. If being with me means risking everything you've worked for, then it's a risk I'm willing to take." Thomas interrupted firmly. "Some things matter more than reputation or career, Clara. And you, quite unexpectedly, have become one of those things to me." 3 days later, a telegram arrived from Nathaniel that changed everything. He had found a member of the Whitmore household staff, a young maid named Sarah, who had been working late on the night of Charles's death and had seen Robert Whitmore entering the house through a side door around 11:30, well before the time Charles was supposed to have died. More importantly, Sarah had found a handkerchief in the study the morning after the murder, monogrammed with Robert's initials and smelling strongly of the expensive French cologne he habitually wore. The maid had kept the handkerchief hidden, afraid to come forward because Robert had threatened to ruin her family if she ever spoke of seeing him that night. But Nathaniel's gentle persistence and his promise of protection had finally convinced her to tell the truth, and she had agreed to testify to what she had witnessed if it meant seeing justice done for Mr. Charles, whom she had genuinely liked and respected. With this evidence in hand, Nathaniel had gone directly to a judge he trusted, one who was not in the Whitmore family's pocket, and obtained a warrant for Robert Whitmore's arrest. The arrest had taken place that very morning, and Robert, faced with the maid's testimony and the physical evidence of the handkerchief, had broken down and confessed everything. He had discovered the truth about Clara's parentage while going through his late father's papers, finding correspondence between Jonathan Whitmore and Catherine Brennan that revealed their affair and Clara's illegitimate birth. Horrified by the realization that his brother had unknowingly married their half-sister, Robert had confronted Charles privately, showing him the evidence and demanding that he annul the marriage immediately to prevent scandal. But Charles, devastated by the revelation, had refused to simply cast Clara aside without explanation. He had wanted time to think, to decide how to handle the situation in a way that would cause the least harm to everyone involved. Robert, fearing that Charles would make the scandal public in some misguided attempt at honesty, had decided that the only solution was to eliminate his brother and make it appear to be suicide driven by marital problems. He had then attempted to frame Clara for the murder, when questions began to arise about the suicide ruling, hoping that she would be arrested and executed before anyone could investigate too deeply. The telegram concluded with Nathaniel's assurance that all charges against Clara had been dropped, that her name had been cleared completely, and that she was free to return to her life without fear of prosecution. The truth about her parentage and her unwitting incestuous marriage would be kept confidential, sealed in court records that would not be made public, allowing her to maintain her dignity and privacy. Thomas read the telegram aloud to Clara, watching as relief and joy and lingering sadness all played across her features. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, processing the magnitude of what had just been revealed. "It's over," she finally said, her voice filled with wonder. "It's truly over. Charles can rest in peace knowing the truth came out, and I can stop running, stop hiding, stop being afraid every moment of every day. It's over," Thomas confirmed, setting the telegram aside and taking her hands in his once more. "And now your life can truly begin again. You're free, Clara. Free to go wherever you wish, to be whoever you want to be, to choose your own path forward." She looked up at him, and in her eyes Thomas saw not uncertainty, but quiet certainty, a decision already made. "And if the path I choose leads me to stay here in Philadelphia, if the life I want to build includes a certain detective who risked everything to prove my innocence and who showed me that trust and affection can exist even in the darkest of circumstances." Thomas felt his heart swell with an emotion he had thought himself incapable of feeling, had convinced himself he was too focused on his work to ever experience. "Then I would consider myself the most fortunate man in this city, and I would spend every day working to prove myself worthy of that trust and affection." Clara smiled then, a genuine smile that transformed her entire face and made her even more beautiful than Thomas had thought possible. She reached up to touch his cheek gently, and he leaned into the caress, marveling at how much had changed in such a short time, how a case that had begun with a frightened widow fleeing through the rain had evolved into something so much more profound and meaningful. "I think we've both been alone for too long, Thomas," she said softly. "I think we've both built walls around our hearts to protect ourselves from further pain. But perhaps it's time to let those walls come down, to take the risk of opening ourselves to the possibility of happiness, even knowing that life offers no guarantees, and that sorrow can find us no matter how carefully we guard against it." "Perhaps it is," Thomas agreed, and then, with a boldness that surprised even himself, he leaned down and kissed her gently, a kiss that held promise and hope, and the tentative beginning of something that might, with time and care, grow into lasting love. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless and smiling with shy delight, Thomas knew that his life had been irrevocably changed. He had set out to solve a murder and clear an innocent woman's name, and in the process, he had found something far more valuable than professional success or personal satisfaction. He had found a partner, someone who understood the complexities of truth and justice, someone who had faced terrible adversity with courage and grace, someone who made him want to be not just a better detective but a better man. The months that followed were a time of healing and new beginnings for both of them. Clara remained in Philadelphia, taking a position as a teacher at a school for young ladies, using her education and experience to help shape young minds while slowly building a new life for herself. Thomas continued his work as a detective, but he found that his perspective had shifted, that he now saw the human stories behind every case with greater compassion and understanding. They courted with old-fashioned propriety, taking long walks through Rittenhouse Square, where they had first shared Clara's secrets, attending concerts and lectures together, spending quiet evenings in Thomas's study, discussing literature and philosophy, and their dreams for the future. The attraction between them deepened into genuine affection, and the affection matured into a love that was steady and sure, built on mutual respect and shared values rather than mere passion. 1 year to the day after their first meeting on that rain-soaked platform, Thomas proposed to Clara in the same gardens where she had trusted him with the truth about her past. He presented her with a simple but elegant ring, and when he asked her to be his wife, she answered without hesitation, her green eyes shining with joy and certainty. They were married in a small ceremony attended only by close friends, including Nathaniel Pemberton, who served as Thomas's best man and who wept unashamedly during the exchange of vows, moved by the knowledge that something beautiful and lasting had emerged from such tragic beginnings. Clara wore a dress of pale blue silk rather than white, a quiet acknowledgement of her past while still celebrating the hope of her future, and she carried a small bouquet of autumn flowers that reminded them both of the season when their paths had first crossed. As they stood together at the altar, promising to love and cherish each other through whatever joys and sorrows life might bring, Thomas looked into Clara's eyes and saw reflected there the same wonder and gratitude he felt in his own heart. They had both known loss and loneliness, had both built walls to protect themselves from further pain, but they had found the courage to let those walls crumble and to embrace the possibility of happiness together. The photograph of Catherine Brennan holding baby Clara, the photograph that had set so much of this tragedy in motion, now held a place of honor in their home, a reminder not of scandal and secrets, but of the complexity of human life and the importance of facing truth with courage. Beside it, Thomas placed their wedding photograph, a testament to the idea that even from the darkest beginnings, love and hope could bloom. And as they began their life together, building a marriage based on honesty and trust and deep affection, both Thomas and Clara knew that they had been given a precious gift, the chance to choose their own story, to write their own ending, and to prove that sometimes, even when circumstances seem impossible and the future appears bleak, two people can find in each other the strength to overcome any obstacle and the courage to believe in happiness once more. The widow who had run without looking back had finally stopped running, and in stopping, she had found not just safety, but love. The detective who had sought only truth had found something far more valuable, a partner to share that truth with, and a future filled with the kind of joy he had never allowed himself to imagine. Together, they faced whatever came next, no longer alone, no longer afraid, but united in a love that had been tested by fire and had emerged stronger, truer, and more precious than either could have dreamed possible.